Hello, I'm SuzanneJames from Green Left. Thank you for joining us. With the federal election imminent, the Australian Greens have launched their latest initiative for the legalisation of recreational cannabis. It was last taken to the Senate by spokesperson for Justice, Senator David Shoebridge, in November last year, when Labor and Liberal worked together to vote it down. To talk to us a bit more about that and where the bill goes from here, Senator Shoebridge joins us now. David, welcome and thank you for your time.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It's always good to be talking about saving thousands and thousands of people from the criminal justice system, creating new industries and new revenue. Very happy to have this chat, Suzanne.
Thank you for joining us. Okay, let's start with what happened with the vote in November. Now, obviously, they voted against it by a significant margin. Was there any justification given for that? Can you give us some insight into what the issues were?
There was no credible opposition. It was the same rhetoric that would have worked in the parliament in 1952 as they rolled out in 2025. It was drugs are bad. If you legalise drugs, then people will consume cannabis. Consuming cannabis is a terrible thing. A bunch of kind of myths were rolled out about the consumption of cannabis. A bunch of data was taken out of context. And then they circled their little weird fear wagons together and voted it down. I mean, it was actually a remarkably uninspiring job from each of them. And a couple of them pointed to having gone to the United States and gone to Canada and not liking smelling cannabis occasionally as the reason why they voted it down as well.
Now, they voted against a bill that the Parliamentary Budget Office and the Australian Greens say had a potential $700 million in revenue plus GST-style income at state and territory levels. Give us the 10-second rundown of where that revenue comes from, David, and how it's generated. So if I walk into a dispensary and buy some cannabis.
Yeah, well, I mean, the good news is not only does legalising cannabis generate state and federal revenue for governments, it also reduces the recreational sale price by about 50% over the first decade of rolling it out. So consumers win and governments win. The only people who lose are, of course, organised crime. And to the extent that police rely upon wanting and needing to police cannabis police for their resources. So our model anticipates a 15% cannabis sales tax. I mean, that's vastly lower than the excise you get on most alcohol and vastly lower than the excise on tobacco. In addition to a 10% GST, which applies to pretty much all goods and services. And then also corporate tax, the profits that small businesses will make from a legalised legal cannabis market. So you bundle that up together and that's how you get the $700 million in Commonwealth revenue. Well, some of that, of course, goes to the states. Some of that's in addition. The GST is in addition to the $700 million because that goes straight to states and territories for hospitals and schools. So it's actually the overall government revenue is close to $1 billion a year, which is a relatively small proportion of the overall sales of cannabis.
Now, the push to legalise recreational cannabis in Australia goes back a long way before medicinal was ever on the board and made illegal. A lot of people simply wanted personal use and grow your own to smoke at home decriminalised, and the drug driving laws changed accordingly. Given what happened with the medical cannabis market being handed wholesale to corporate cannabis and blocking everybody else out, do you have any concerns and what protections are in the bill to protect home growers? I understand it says you can grow 6 plants, you can cook with your own goods, but can you give us some detail on what protections are there for people that do grow at home and what assurances can we have that's not going to be hijacked by corporate cannabis and the price go through the roof like everything else?
Well, we've looked at the experience in medicinal cannabis and it's a far from perfect market that's been created, but the more than 500,000 people who have already accessed the medicinal cannabis scheme, I think are overwhelmingly grateful that Parliament's state and federal legislated to have a medicinal cannabis scheme, even if it's imperfect. I mean, that's 500,000 people who have far more viable access to quality controlled medicinal cannabis than happened before. But we looked at the experience in the United States and Canada. We looked at the experience in medicinal cannabis. And so our bill would prohibit the pharmaceutical industry. It would prohibit the alcohol industry and would prohibit the tobacco industry from taking part in this new startup legal industry that we're creating in the form of a legal cannabis market. We have said that if an entity is engaging only in medicinal cannabis, that they are exempted from that prohibition from the pharmaceutical industry. So if a player is currently producing medicinal cannabis, they'd also be able to produce recreational cannabis. But of course, some of the big medicinal cannabis players are also global tobacco multinationals, and they would be prohibited from having a role in this market. And so we've created a scheme that is intended to prioritise small business and localised business, particularly regional jobs in the growing and initial manufacture of cannabis products, encouraging small dispensary and cafe-style outlets as the primary distribution centre for recreational cannabis, and also putting in place protection so that people can grow up to 6 plants at home, and then, provided it's under adult supervision, then if they want to bake a brownie and have some adult friends around and share their brownie on a Friday afternoon, they're welcome to do that as well. And you can have the 6 plants and you can bake a brownie without paying any tax and without getting a license, provided you're an adult.
One of the issues some people still have with medical cannabis is that they're unable to afford it because it's not on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. So if you're, for example, wheelchair or disabled, unable to grow 6 plants of your own, your neighbour who's growing some over the fence still technically can't give it to you or sell it to you at cost, and you still have to go to a dispensary and pay retail price for it. What do you say to those people?
Well, the good news when it comes to those people like myself who are desperate to get medicinal cannabis on the PBS is that the Greens have just launched a policy for our health folks to do exactly that. If we get into a minority government, one of the things we will be pushing for is ensuring that medicinal cannabis is on the PBS. I mean, it is absolutely ridiculous that people who need medicinal cannabis, sometimes for intractable pain, sometimes for PTSD and other conditions, there's a chunk of society who can't get medicinal cannabis because they simply can't afford it, and yet their doctor is prescribing it. And I've had, I couldn't tell you how many people come and tell me that they had used medicinal cannabis on the advice of their doctor. It had had incredibly positive benefits. People have been able to get off long-term opiate addiction, which is incredibly debilitating. They've been able to deal with their pain or other conditions, and their life had changed, but then found they couldn't afford it because none of it was covered under the PBS, and then had been forced to go back to substandard medicines and seen their life deteriorate because opiates, although being more damaging and more addictive, are covered by the PBS. We want that to end. We want that to end.
I know same doctors are writing opioid scripts at the rate of 12.5 million a year, which are on the PBS. So clearly there's an anomaly there that needs to change. One of the issues home growers have, obviously, is whether or not they can get hold of seed. Now, as you know, overseas buy-ins are heavily policed by Border Force and by Austrac, and a lot of those avenues have been cut off to people that may want to grow at home. It's not illegal to possess seed as far as I know, but would be very difficult for people to get a hold of. What protections are in this bill that people won't, for example, be subject to Monsanto-style genetic modification cases if they want to have their own seed or grow a particular variety? How's that all going to work?
Well, the bill consciously doesn't change any of the existing intellectual property laws or trademark laws or patent laws. In fact, it's based upon the Commonwealth's patent power, which is how we register strains. So if it's currently legal to trade and swap seeds, that's not going to be changed in any way by the fact that the seed has been registered. For legislation, for cannabis to be covered by the federal bill, the strain, the type, will simply need to be registered with the national authority. But that anybody can register any strain. It doesn't give any intellectual property rights, any exclusive rights, any private property protections through strains being registered. And, we've consciously wanted to create a market where people can literally grow 6 plants at home without having to register, without having to license, without having to pay tax. And what we would expect to see would be that part of the sector, and I think realistically it's only ever going to be a small part of the sector, people wanting to grow their own cannabis. Like, I like growing tomatoes, but, I don't grow tomatoes all year for my own crop. And the bulk of the tomatoes bought and sold in Australia are bought and sold through a commercial market. We expect that to be the same in the cannabis market, consistent with international experience. But if people want to grow their own without a license, without tax, and trade seeds amongst themselves, this bill places no additional restrictions, and in fact removes a whole lot of quite significant criminal penalties that currently exist.
Speaking of criminal penalties, and I'll finish on this because I know you're running out of time, I'd like to touch briefly on the current state of the drug driving laws. Now, Tasmania is the only state, as far as I'm aware, that has drug driving laws, that has a carve-out for people who have script-provided medical cannabis. What's the current state of play across the rest of the country in relation to that? Because as with medical cannabis, it's pretty difficult to allow personal use if you're just going to be jumped all over by the police every time you drive a car for having 0.0006% of THC in your blood.
Well, I'm on record as saying our drug driving laws when it comes to cannabis are broken. They're broken across the country. Tasmania has some protections. There's an exclusion if someone has a medicinal cannabis script for the mere presence offence. Victoria has proposed some changes in that regard. They still haven't been fully legislated through the parliament. But the only rationale that police and state and territory governments have for having a zero tolerance approach to even the smallest detectable amount of cannabis in people's systems is that it's an illegal drug. That's how they differentiate cannabis from benzodiazepines or opiates. They say, well, the reason we have a zero tolerance approach to cannabis is because it's illegal. As soon as it becomes a legal drug, that whole justification falls away. And I would expect we would get rapid reform in the states and territories where we'll have an impairment style testing for cannabis. And, obviously that's where we should be with road safety. I don't care if a drug is legal or illegal. If it's impairing somebody's driving, then they should not be behind the wheel having consumed that drug. And we have this bizarre system at the moment where across the country, police have drug checking systems that could measure, for example, whether or not people had benzodiazepines in their system. They choose not to measure benzodiazepines in people's system because it's not illegal, and yet they measure for the smallest detectable quantity of cannabis. So somebody might be stopped by police and lose their license and face serious criminal penalties because they'd had a joint 3 days ago. No threat to any other road users. The next driver may come along, be zonked to the eyeballs on prescription benzodiazepine, be an incredible risk to other road users, and then just be waved through by police. And that is not a sustainable approach to road safety. It's not about road safety. So I would expect once we get this through, and I think it's a question of when, not if, once we get through a national market for legalised cannabis, that kind of appallingly non-road safety approach to testing for cannabis will, I think, inevitably fall away.
Senator David Shoebridge, that's all we have time for, but thank you so much for joining us today and taking us through your latest initiative to try and legalise recreational cannabis in Australia. I'm SuzanneJames from Green Left.